Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from. Hi, my name is Abhijit Bhaduri. I work as an executive coach and I also work with organizations and individuals on their personal branding and the talent branding processes. But today I'm going to talk to you about something which is very dear to my heart, which has been the subject of season three of Dreamers and Unicorns show, which, as you know, we've been doing a show almost every week, with the exception of those little weeks in between when I take a break, but which is also very important as we will discuss today. But today, I want to bring to you the person who got me thinking about wellness and to really look at it beyond mental wellness, which is what most people really do. So really, what does it mean in terms of physical well-being, mental well-being, spiritual well-being, and of course your emotional well-being, which is about the relationships that you have. This is a live show. What it means is there's a great opportunity for me to interact with you. For all the listeners who are there, do add your questions, and from time to time, I'll bring up your comments and questions. Do tell us where you are joining us from and what are some of the questions you have based on either what we are talking about or questions that you may generally have. So, without further ado, we are going to bring in Dr. Ashwin. Hi there, Dr. Naik.
Hi, Vijay. How are you?
Hey, good, good, good. So I kind of, whenever I schedule a doctor on the show, I'm always apprehensive whether the doctor is going to make it in time or not. So yeah, delighted that you are here with us.
Yes.
I want to, start by really asking you about your journey. Did you always want to be a doctor, or this is one of those safe choices? Doctor, engineer, chartered accountant, lawyer. It's one of the safe options. But you are also much more than that. So I want to really know about that little incident that triggered this whole movement. Talk to me about
Right.
that.
Yeah, that's an interesting backstory. Now, I my entire life I have grown up in small towns across India like Faridabad, Dharwad, Karwar, and places like that. And in those places, from an early age, my sort of exposure to the outside world was through books. And for some reason, when I was very young, maybe in my ninth or 10th year, 9 or 10 years of age, I read some books about science and research and scientists. So from the very beginning, as far as back as I can remember, I always thought that I'll be a scientist. But there's no traditional path to being a scientist, right? So I finished my high school, wrote both the exams for engineering and medicine, and got through both of them. And there was a family pressure that you should get into medicine because we had a bunch of engineers. There was no doctor in the family. And I think while I didn't like the decision at that point, but in hindsight, I think it was uh, great opportunity for me to shape my career, and for two reasons. One is I ended up at a government medical college hospital, which had some of the best minds as teachers. And the second is medical education, much like legal education and some of the other professional educations, is one of the few where you get to interact with a whole range of people at once. Barring first year, second year onwards, you're interacting with the third year people, you're interacting with your professors, you're interacting with patients, you're interacting with public, and that's very rare in a professional education setting at 19 years age to get to see all this. So what it helped me to do is expand my horizon, interact with different people. And also, luckily, the college was not very particular about education or studies. They knew that they will get some students who will do well and give them the glory of medical education, and they were very encouraging in terms of arts and literature and all that. So that's how my journey was. And in the final year of medical school, I spent a lot of time reading about the back history of some of these researchers, doctors, scientists, and I really got interested and revived my interest. And I said I have to go back to science as a faculty, and went to US, did my masters, enrolled for a PhD, and finally ended up with my first job as a scientist working on the Human Genome Project. So that's a long answer to your question of how I ended with this
So
story.
you
So
were
my
involved
first
with the
education, yeah.
Human Genome Project? That's
Yes,
incredible.
yes, yes. I think that was another, I would say, a seminal moment in my life, because very rarely in history you will get an opportunity to work on these amazing projects, right? The Human Genome Project, first of its kind, and that too in an environment where there was a competition between the public sector and the private sector. And I joined a startup which was challenging how the Human Genome Project, which is traditionally a public enterprise, right, which is an academic exercise. And here was a startup which said, we are going to put all the effort and energy and do this much faster, cheaper, and better than the government one. So I got in, and again, it was a crazy experience to work with, not only scientists, but we had physicists, we had computer scientists, we had lawyers, a full floor of lawyers, because human genome is a very touchy topic from an intellectual property point of view. But luckily, all of this paid off, and in 2001, we completed the Human Genome Project, published. I was involved in the rat and mouse genome. So very interesting experiences there as a first job, I would say, which was very enriching.
What did it do to you in terms of the way that you view the future today? How did that experience of working on the Human Genome Project shape
Yeah.
this?
So the Human Genome Project was, important for me for two reasons. One is that it was a sort of landmark event for all of us. But secondly, it shaped two things in my mind. And this is, I tell everybody, Celera, which was the company which did the Genome Project, the
Yeah.
internal saying was, if you give an impossible deadline and limited resources, people do amazing things. So that was a sort of a defining moment for me, that if there is a hard challenge, don't give enough resources and put a very artificially, like a tough deadline, and then people will find a way to solve it. So that was an internal learning. The second learning for me was, there is no public and private problems, right? Even though there is a problem in the public sector, private sector can address it. So when I came back to India in 2002, and we started working on building the rural health network, which is traditionally a government responsibility. We use a lot of learnings from this experience from Celera and said, it doesn't matter, it's a problem. Either the government will solve, if the government can't solve, private sector can also solve. So we built the network of hospitals to address rural healthcare under the brand of Vatsalya.
So, how long were you working on Vatsalya before the first hospital came up? Talk to me about that moment.
Yeah, I think two things we started with. We said there is a gap in the rural healthcare sector, and we want to do something about it. We didn't really know what we will do, and we said we have to start somewhere. So let's start with a clinic in one of the cities. And for that, we tried to raise money. It was very difficult to raise money in those days for rural healthcare. But one thing that worked for us is, many NRIs were our first backers, our first angel investors. And for them, more than the financial sort of opportunity, they were seeing this as a personal thing, right? Their families were back home, their parents were probably aging and in small towns as well. There is a need, and they were our first backers. So since a group of angel investors came together and invested their first round of money, we were able to set up something within about 15 months or so. And
Wow.
when we were setting up our first center, we also got some interest from venture capitalists who said, we'd like to look at this space. And then we quickly built two more facilities within a couple of years. So in terms of getting things started, it was not very complex. I think once we started to scale up is when we had a lot of challenges.
So did you see yourself more like a doctor, or did you see yourself like a entrepreneur, or how do you describe your phase of building Vatsalya chain?
So both of us founders, me and my partner, we were very clear that we will not be involved in the clinical side of the work. We will get the right good doctors come on board, and we will really play the role of catalysts in this whole journey. And our role was more of entrepreneurs, like you say, but really also figuring out what are the key levers that we need to move for this to work, right? One is getting doctors to come back to these small towns. Second is building the infrastructure, nursing, clinical equipments and all that. But lastly, how do you make it affordable? That's where we spent a lot of time, because it's easy to put up a large hospital, but how do we make it affordable to 60-70% of the local population? That took a lot of effort.
Generally, the belief is that if you make it affordable, quality takes a beating. How did you manage that challenge?
Yeah. So that's absolutely right. I think the reason some of the hospitals are at a higher end of the financial spectrum is because they invest a lot in the high end latest equipment. But if you think about it, 80% of people go to hospital not for complicated neurosurgery or cardiac surgery kind of things, right? What they need is a good quality maternity care, good quality pediatrics, good quality internal medicine, and things like our small surgeries. And what we did was we focused on these four specialties and said we will focus on high utilization of these services, meaning that we'll have a lot of people coming in for these services, and then drive the quality in such a way. The second part is about 60% of quality of care in a hospital is linked to how well your staff is trained. Not the quality of your doctors, not the quality of your equipments, but how well your nursing staff and other staff is trained. So first of all, finding people with high levels of empathy, and then training them and giving them the power to go out and serve the customers and the families of patients was something that we invested a lot in.
And from Vatsalya chain, and you got recognized as a Ashoka Fellow and all of that. I mean, talk to me about that recognition and what did that do for you?
Yeah, we have been blessed because of the model that Vatsalya set up. A lot of organizations recognized it, both as a pioneering rural health initiative, but also as a social enterprise. That word was new for us, but people recognized it as a social enterprise using private sector resources to solve a social problem. And with that came, the recognition of Ashoka Fellowship, TED Fellowship, and World Economic Forum. I think what it did was obviously validated that what we are doing is important and impactful, but also helped us become more ambitious in our approach, and said, we can now go out and do more. And the second one was, at some point we also realized that this is a universal issue. It's not a small town India issue, it's a universal issue of access. And then we started thinking about how can this model be replicated with in other geographies, how can we share what we have learned with others. So that's how the journey sort of transitioned.
Thanks, Ashwin. I'm talking to Dr. Ashwin Naik, who, as you just heard, is a Ashoka Fellow. He's a TED Fellow recognized by World Economic Forum for the pioneering work that he has done in rural healthcare chains, the hospitals that he set up. But today, what I'm going to talk to you is about wellness. And this is really the field that Dr. Ashwin Naik is now working on. And so I wanted to really understand what is the current mission that excites you? Uh, talk to me about Manah Wellness and how did that come about?
Yeah, so like I said, I grew up in small town India, and mental health And wellness is a very personal issue for me because my mother was underdiagnosed for about 10 years. And traditionally what happens is when women of certain age have some issues, it's not considered a mental health issue. Either you attach it to menopause, hormonal changes, and so on and so forth. So she was underdiagnosed for about 10 years. But once we found the right doctor for her and she was diagnosed properly, she was back to her normal life in like 2 months. So that always stayed with me. The only reason she had to suffer for 10 years was she didn't have access to a good clinician. And the only reason for that was she was in a small town. Now, technology in the last 10 years has developed to a stage where we can overcome this barrier, right, of access because of geography. So that's how I got interested in the mental health space. And in 2015, with a friend of mine, we started a brand called Serenity, which focused on bringing affordable counseling and therapy sessions and psychiatric sessions online to different parts of the country. That business got acquired by CureFit in 2019 and is now rebranded as MindFit. And since 2020, since the pandemic started, I've been looking at the emotional well-being at workplace. Because
Mm.
one thing that has happened in the last 2 years is, irrespective of what COVID is and will be, I think the big change which will happen is in how workplaces of the future will look like, what employment will look like, what is hybrid work, and how all of this will impact not only your workspace but also your emotional well-being. We are not designed to spend 24 hours of our lives within our own homes, right? We are social animals. Work was, in many cases, particularly in countries like India, was a relief. You got out of the home, went to an air conditioned place where everything was structured for you. Many cases, offices were much better structured than homes, right? Now you are stuck in your rooms trying to deal with all kinds of things, and emotional impact of that is significant. So we built this new brand called Manah Wellness, working with companies to support their employee well-being. We right now work with over 50 companies both in India and in Singapore, and support the employee well-being of about 18,000 employees across these companies.
So, when you say we support wellness for employees, specifically, what do you do for these 50 clients? What kind of scenarios are there? What do you do, and what is the problem you're trying to solve for them?
Right. One of the big challenges, Abhijit, in the mental health space is it's fairly reactive. Something has to go wrong before some intervention is done. Our approach has been, don't wait for things to go wrong. Don't wait for things to employees to burn out. Don't wait for employees to quit their job because they can't handle the stress. Don't wait for issues to spiral out of control. Like we say, if you're looking for the big event, then it's probably too late. So how do we focus on the small events? And the way to start with is doing an assessment of the current state of well-being of employees. So we start everything with an assessment, much like you do a physical health checkup at the beginning of the year. Our belief is in the future you would do an annual well-being check, which gives you an idea of what is the current state where you are, what are the challenges that you might run into, and what are the coping mechanisms that you might need. Once we get that report for the individual and for the entire organization, we create specific interventions tailored to individuals, whether it is counseling, therapy, or other support. And at the organization level, we also run different programs which include well-being challenges, well-being retreats, educational programs, and also building capacity within the organization to train people to become mental health champions, so that they can identify issues within their networks, within their teams, within their company much before they become big issues.
So, in some sense, it is a lot like doing the vision. If I were to understand you, it is a lot like becoming first aid champions for mental health. So you
Yes,
recognize the signs and all of that.
yes,
Um, what are some of the early warning signs that, if I were to take it for myself, what should I be looking out for? What are some of the things, whether it's burnout or stress, or what are those usual things that are, as you said, that if you are looking for the big breakdown, then it's probably too late anyway. But
Right.
what is it that people should be looking out for? So, what are things I should watch?
Yeah. So, that's an interesting question, because when people talk about emotional challenges or well-being challenges, most people think of it in extremes. They think of it as in, breakdown, depression, you are burnt out, etc. But mental health and well-being impacts all of us on a daily basis, right? You have good days, bad days, you have, tough days, etc. So the
Sure.
trick is to really to identify who is not able to cope with these things, because there's no way we can avoid stress at workplace. That's not
Yeah.
happening, right? There's going to be some kind of stress. The ability to handle that, the ability to manage it, is what we should be focusing on. But in spite of that, if you see repeated absenteeism, a change of behavior or uninvolvement in meetings, or not contributing as earlier, I think that gives a signal that it's time for a chat, right? Getting somebody to speak to that person and identifying if there is something going on with their family, with their personal life, and really having that conversation is the first step, right? And in the last 1 year, this has been an extraordinary time, right? In the last 1 year, everybody, I know, has gone through some personal loss, right? And it's obviously going to impact you in a significant way. Now, being accommodative of those kind of situation in a work environment has become extremely important, to the extent that we believe that going forward, knowing how to support their employee well-being is going to be a leadership skill. It's not an HR skill that is required. It's really every leader in an organization will have to build the capacity, will have to build the skills to be able to identify these small points or big points, and be able to have the conversation with the individual to help them overcome those issues.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that because I remember in one of my LinkedIn posts I did write about the fact that if you look at it as a competency, then it is something that you train towards. You learn to recognize the symptoms, you do the assessments, but if you don't do that, then it becomes something that takes you by surprise. And
Yes.
historically, talking about mental health issues has been taboo. People don't either they don't know how to handle it and therefore don't want to talk about it, or the belief is, as you said, that I've seen that people with even things like cerebral palsy, there's a friend of mine who has that, and he says for the first 9 years or 10 years of his life, his parents were told that your son is mad, uh,
Yeah.
and therefore was not allowed to be put into a regular school. So,
Yeah.
just the lack of awareness can be a devastating, challenge to deal with. Um,
Yes.
what What do you see has changed about our comfort in accepting, well-being in the way that you are defining in a very broad sense of mental well-being as well as physical and all that? You see a
Yeah.
change, or is it still a subject of taboo?
I think it's a subject of taboo. I don't think we have yet, become very open to it. But things are changing. Every time people ask me this question, I look back on some historical reference. Right? If you look at diversity and inclusion, it started with the conversation, right? It started with asking the question that why don't we have diversity at workplace? Or if you go back in history and talk about even physical fitness 40 years ago, the only people who went to the gyms were bodybuilders. If you went to, there was a little bit of unacceptance, right? Today, if you don't go to a gym, it's you're an outsider. Our belief is in the next 10 years, going and seeking support for mental well-being and improvement will be as common as going to the gym. and then the conversation will shift completely, right? Till that time, all of us will have to do a little bit to move the conversation forward, make sure that people are aware of these issues. And one thing, Abhijit, I think we have to realize is mental health and mental illness are two different things.
Hmm.
Mental illness impacts 10 to 12% of the population. Mental health impacts all of us, 100% of the population, right? So as long
Wow.
as we start realizing that mental health is what we all need as individuals, and more importantly as employees, parents, and citizens, I think we will be able to make much bigger impact on this space. As long as we talk about mental health as illness, I think we'll make very little progress.
And when you look at the ability of the organizations to address this issue from the competency point of view, what should they be setting up? What is the infrastructure they need to be investing in? What kind of partnerships should they be building in? Talk to me about how some of your clients have gone about doing it when they approached you. What was the trigger, or was there no trigger? They just had, leaders who thought about it. What do you see as common patterns?
Yeah. So there are three types of organizations that work with us. Number one, organizations who really believe that it is important to support employee well-being given the circumstance, right? They are truly progressive organizations, they believe, and it starts from the CEO, the CHRO level, right? They say, what can we do to help with employee well-being? So that's one type of organization. The second one is somebody who has had an adverse event at workplace, right? Either they had a employee going through a serious issue, or somebody in their immediate family had an issue. They are saying, how can we make sure that if this happens in the future, we are ready. And the third type of organization is curious about what else can we do, what can we do to support employee well-being given that everybody is talking about it. And each of these organizations come with different expectations, and then we start working with them in identifying what are the critical factors that they should look at. But most importantly, we spend a lot of time in getting leadership buy-in. The number one success factor of implementing a well-being program in any organization is leadership buy-in. And we have seen it over and over again. Unless we have got the CEO talking about it or the CHRO talking about it, it will be just another HR initiative which will die its own death, natural death in few months. So we spend a lot of time in making sure that we have the right leadership buy-in, so that it percolates across the organization. And then we put in effort to engage all employees, not just few employees who are seeking therapy or counseling. So that's what I would say has been our experience of it.
When this morning I was actually on a panel with on LinkedIn, and we were talking about how do you talk about organization culture when the entire workforce is remote.
Hmm.
One of the unspoken elements of the remote workplace, and you sort of referred to it briefly earlier, this isolation that we have, the lack of social contact.
Yeah.
The question I have is that we are not meeting our friends or loved ones or colleagues or anyone, even strangers. We are not meeting them often enough in person.
Yeah.
It's only on video or Zoom like this we are talking to people. Is, let us say, an 8 hour conversation with a variety of people, is that the equivalent of 8 hours of in person meeting? Yes or no?
Oh, that's a tough one. That's a tough one. Um, this entire interface is not natural for us, right? I mean, the ability to read each other's emotions, body language, the energy that you pass to each other just by being in the room together, right? It cannot be done through a Zoom meeting. I mean, we can try as much as we can, but it's very tough to do. So I think there is something to be said about how do you transfer the same level of empathy, the emotions, the energy from a face-to-face interaction to this. Having said that, I think, you know, uh, the future of work is clearly hybrid. I don't think we are ever going to go back to this idea that people have to come to a central place to be productive, right? That's not going to happen. The other equation is that we have to be 8 hours Zoom call. I think that's also not going to happen. The answer is going to be somewhere in between, right? There are companies already planning their workforce in a way that they meet once a month for 2 days and the rest of the time it's remote. It could be once a quarter or it could be anything like that, but
Sure.
there has to be an opportunity for people to come, get to know each other in person, and sort of transfer that energy, if you will. And a large part of that is, again, going back to your question, how do we build the elements of culture that we want the entire organization to sort of live by, right? And it's going to be very, very tough if it's entirely remote. Imagine hiring people now. They have never been to your office, they've never met your colleagues, they've just started their career in a remote setting. It's extremely hard. And then, there are other challenges. 80%, 90% of our homes in India are not geared up to work from home, right? We have so many other things happening in our lives. So how do we make sure that we are able to dedicate time and space? All of these challenges are there. So I think, if I were to go back to your question, building culture remotely would be a significant investment of organizations and HR leaders over the next decade. And I think there'll be a lot of new elements, like you said, mental health. How do we reward and recognize people? How do we take breaks in this new hybrid environment, etc.? Will become very interesting topics to think about.
I also think that one of the ways when we think about work,
Mm.
I also think that we need to use a fresh lens to be able to think about work. So, for example, um, when people say that it's possible to entirely do everything, on Zoom, functionally speaking, absolutely, it is possible to do most of the things. Unless you are, of course, working in a lab where you need to, work with either equipment or the chemicals and all that stuff, or manufacturing facilities. You can't manufacture a car on Zoom or pharmaceuticals. So there are sectors where it is tough to do.
Right.
Having said that, I think there is a emotional fulfillment that we derive out of in-person conversations, and the best way to answer that is, I often tell people that imagine you have the option to never ever meet any friend of yours, bit like what we've experienced in the last 2 years, but in an extreme, forever. You're not going to be able to meet them in person. You can only do calls on video, etc., with them. Would you ever feel the need to meet them in person? And if the answer is yes, and I think that's really what we are referring to, that a lot of times people want to go to the workspace for socializing, the
Yeah.
social need, the coffee table conversations, the little understanding of the culture of the organization. And one of the pieces that happens is why it causes so much stress is because many of the things that we pick up by observing others, we lose on video. And
Yeah.
that causes stress. So you're saying something, are people listening?
Yeah.
Are others engaged? Do they disagree? You can't do that. It's
Yeah.
ineffective. So I think
Yeah.
those are many reasons why we perhaps add a component person going back to the office.
Yeah.
When you
Yeah.
think workspace, mental well-being, or well-being in general, if we talk about that, where do you see Mana Wellness, the role of the company that you have? What role do you see it performing in, let's say, 5 years from now? Where do you see it going?
Right. Before I get into that, Abhijit, one of the interesting parallels to what you said is the tribal nature of humans, right? We all want to belong to a tribe, and work in many cases is a tribe for us, right? It gives, of course, it gives you the financial sort of support to survive, etc. But it also creates a very strong sense of belonging, right? And what is culture but a strong sense of belonging, alignment with something greater than yourself, right? And coming back to your question, we want to be that organization which helps you build that culture, that belongingness, that psychological safety at work, where employees feel that, okay, this is a place where I belong. I feel I am safe to experiment. I feel I am safe to say what is on my mind, and there are people to support me. And all of this needs organizations to recognize that it's important for to train people in emotional well-being, and also the ability to recognize signs of emotional distress. So our role is really to build capacity. If I look ahead 10 years, I think there will be a chief well-being officer at large organizations, right? Because my prediction is, in the future organizations are really collection of people which basically are designed for well-being of individuals, and then they do together something, to serve a purpose, make a product or deliver a service. But really the role of the organization is to look after the well-being, and well-being, financial, spiritual, emotional, physical, emotional, all of that. And if that is the core of the organization, we need somebody to anchor that. And I believe it has already started. It's not that I'm sort of hypothesizing here. Deloitte has a chief well-being officer, right?
Yes.
So they've already appointed somebody. So I'm beginning to believe that that will be a trend that we'll see over the next decade.
So, does the chief well-being officer need to be a medical doctor, or just somebody who has an incredible ability to empathize? Which of the two would you choose?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a somebody who has high level of empathy, high level of recognition that this is an important skill. If you remember in the early days of HR, there was
Hmm.
no structured program, right? There was no human resource department. My father, I remember, was admin, personal, those kind of departments, right? And there is a
Absolutely.
subset of people realize that this is much more than bookkeeping or record keeping, right? And how do I build the capacity to proactively? I think there will be a new stream of people who will be evolving, and second, there will also be a structured program where people will be trained as chief well-being officers.
And when you look at the organizations who currently do not have uh, any space for, let's say, well-being, this has not been part of their agenda. They haven't thought about it, and it has actually forced a number of organizations to talk about issues which they have traditionally never dealt with. And
Yeah.
I can sort of vouch for that, because the number of organizations which are now really trying to see how do we focus on the intangible elements, and the intangible elements have become far more.
Yeah.
If today, among the listeners who we have here, there are individuals, I recognize some of the people who are very well-known coaches, who are from educational institutions, and there are corporate leaders here. I recognize many of the names, and thank you so much for joining. The question I have from one of them is, if you had to get started tomorrow morning, what are some of the steps, three, four, five things that you need to do to be able to um, start to put well-being on the agenda? And perhaps if they wanted to work with you, what really is the method to go about doing that? How would you talk, whether work with you or somebody else, anyone, I mean, whichever way.
Yeah. So there are many things you can do, of course. One thing that we don't recommend to do is one-off activities, right? Don't do a webinar, don't do a workshop and forget about it, right? So that's the worst thing to start with. What we recommend is three things. Start by asking your employees, right? What is it that will be helpful for their emotional well-being? Let them come up with ideas. The second is co-create with them, right? Create, for example, the best thing to do is to create a small committee of employees and not do it top down from the HR team. And third is find the right resources for whatever they are struggling with. If they're saying employees are typically struggling today with work life balance, managing relationships, extreme burnout, creating boundaries between work and life, and things like that. So bring experts who can address those issues and answer their questions in a sensitive and empathetic manner. And then immediately we recommend that you do a assessment of of the entire team using very standardized techniques, which gives you an idea of what individual struggles are there in different groups. And second, as an organization, what could be some big elements that are affecting the employees, and then decide what you want to do based on those results.
So, what I hear you say is that make an assessment, talk to the employees, and which is probably a very, nice way of looking at it, because it's not one person's view of what should be done. It's really
Right.
what the employees feel, where there is an actual need to be addressed, whatever that might be. Um, I'm going to sort of really, as we are getting to the end of this conversation, I just want to seek your advice. And since we have a doctor on board, I just think that we must actually get some free advice from you. Yeah. um, One of the questions I would have is, um, today, what are some of the two or three things that we can do for physical well-being? And I'm going to talk to you about physical well-being, the spiritual well-being, emotional well-being, mental well-being, all of that. I'm going to sort of bring that up. What are one or two things that you do to stay healthy? Because I know you lead a extremely busy life, and you are managing a bunch of different things. You're an entrepreneur, you're a doctor, you're an advisor, you're, so there's so many different things, which is quite inspiring. How do you handle physical well-being?
Yeah. So first of all, Abhijit, I think people should identify what makes sense for them at the stage in life, their social situation, etc. Because what I worry about is there is so much emphasis on physical fitness nowadays that people have developed this sense of guilt if they're not able to make the time to go to the gym, etc. I think it's okay. I think we don't have to go to the extreme of becoming,
Schwarzenegger.
obsessed. Exactly, obsessed with fitness. I think it's okay. Moderate physical exercise, whether it is walking, or anything which is moderate, doable. The important point is finding something that you can do continuously without getting bored for 1 year, 2 year, 3 year at a time. Because much like everything, exercise and physical fitness also compounds. No point doing something for 1 month and forgetting about it again. It'll not give you the results that you want. Second is, if you want to invest in a mix of mental and physical wellness, I think that's probably the best way to approach this. And everything in moderation. I'm not of a belief that you have to take anything to extreme. I don't believe in dieting. I don't believe in going after meditation retreat or intense meditation. Everything in moderation. If you can allocate 30 minutes, 40 minutes for per day, I think it's a good start. The key is consistency. The key is not to do amazing different things every day. Same boring things done, 5 days a week, good enough.
Yeah, I think in many ways, I remember when I was trying to learn how to play a musical instrument. My teacher used to tell me that, look, I'd rather that you spend 15 minutes every day practicing, rather than to spend 5 hours on one particular day and then never show up for the next 3 months. You're
Yeah,
not going to learn anything. So,
yeah,
so I think the whole message that I pick from you is, whether it's so if you're not able to go to the gym, it's okay. Something moderate is good enough. If you're able to allocate 30 to 40 minutes of the day for your physical and mental well-being, that's a good start. The key lies in just doing it consistently, maybe 5 days a week, and take 2 days off. Even that itself, that freedom, I think, really makes a difference. What are one or two
Absolutely.
things that we can do to avoid burnout and stress? What are some of the things that you would say?
So, stress and burnout in corporate environment is a given. I think there's always going to be some element of stress. I mean, how do you avoid that becoming, overwhelming, right? Ability to manage stress is more important than avoiding stress. So, how do you build that coping mechanism, right? And there are two ways that we think are relevant. One is individual coping mechanisms, and second, if you have seen the recent publication, is that uh, how do you leverage the community to build that resilience? For a very long time, we have been told that we have to build internal resilience. Now the thinking is you don't have to do it alone. How do you build a community around you to support you in times like this? Talking to people, getting access to support from friends, family, etc. That's the kind of resilience which is more long lasting than this whole idea that you have to overcome through strong will things that are affecting you. So building that social infrastructure for overcoming these issues like stress and burnout, of course, with individual efforts, will go a long way.
And I think what you said is so true that this whole business of doing it by yourself, building your own resilience and, by yourself, that isolation. Um, I think that's more of a Western point of view, whereas the Eastern point of view that we've always grown up with is that your well-being comes from a sense of well-being, being a part of the community. Investing in it, receiving from it, investing in your relationships becomes really critically important. Um,
Yeah,
I just really think that it's been an incredible opportunity for me to partner with you. I know that we've never spoken about it explicitly, but season three of Dreamers and Unicorns, was thanks to Dr. Ashwin Naik and Manah Wellness. Uh, really valued the partnership and the opportunity I've had, thanks to this partnership, to be able to talk about wellness in the workplace and also learn from so many of the people, how to live a more fulfilling and enriching life. And that I owe to you. You've been quite a source of inspiration for me personally. So thank you so very much. And I truly appreciate your being here. I know you've been in the middle of a number of different things. You yourself have recovered from COVID, or barely recovered, I should say,
yeah,
which is why we couldn't have the conversation last week. But this
yeah.
is brilliant. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Abhijit, for your partnership. I think it's been incredible the way you have taken the conversation around well-being into workplaces with some of these amazing leaders that we've been able to attract. But more importantly, translating the need of well-being as a skill, like you said, in the workplace for the future. I think it's been an incredible experience for us. Thanks again for partnering with us on this journey.
Thank you very, very much. And, for all those who are listening in and tuning in, thank you so much for joining. I appreciate all the comments and the nice things you've had to say. And we are going to have another very interesting guest on Sunday evening at 7 p.m. Don't forget to join us. Until then, goodbye. Take care. Stay connected. Stay curious.